Hinrikus, and I come from Estonia. And I am assistant professor in Tallinn University and researcher in Under and Douglas Literature Center. Tammsaare is the greatest Estonian novelist between the two world wars. For Estonians, he is a monumental figure as, for example, Franz Emil Sillander is for Finns, Knut Hamsun for Norwegians, or Thomas Hardy for Brits. Also, Tammsaare's work is much less widely known in Europe than that of other three authors mentioned. This is not an occasion for asking why this is the case, but the three serve as a useful context. If we are looking for European comparisons for Tammsaare, we are most likely to find him in these three of his contemporaries. The main theme of Tammsaare's work as a whole is the process of modernization, the transformation of a pre-modern agrarian society into a modern one. The emotional focus of Tammsaare's work is the process of individuation of his male protagonists, who are representatives either of a village society undergoing modernization or the first generation of educated city dwellers, so-called university students, whose life trajectory partly overlaps with the authors. The present paper will focus on two texts by Tammsaare. The first is a 77-page novella, The Shapes of the Shadows, published in 1917, with an implicitly perceptible influence of World War I. The second text that I will touch upon very briefly is his 190-page novel, I Love the German. It was published in 1935 during Estonia's so-called silent era and analyzed not just the relationship between Estonians and Baltic Germans, but also the painful questions of the 1930s, above all, the dangers of growing nationalism in the context of the financial crisis and inflation. In 1919, 2 years after the publication of Shadows, Tammsaare writes in one of his many articles, "Oh, it was once easier for a person to live than today. It was easier then when he still believed in certain unchanging gods, things, even events, and he believed that he possessed a part of the gods, and hence eternity. But now he has found that both gods and things, be they enormous or tiny, change, and with them changes the observing person forever and ever. Nothing remains, nothing stands still. A person of our time is starting to lose both of these supports. The best equivalent to describe the being around us is still the eternally flowing time, or, as advised by an ancient Greek thinker, flowing water." I'm quoting this article extract because the experience of modernity expressed in it has obvious connections to the tone of the male protagonists and male-centered narrators of Tammsaare's fiction, and the experience they convey, one that contains both a sharpened time consciousness, relativity of the perception of change, as well as an awareness of the essential difference between the pre-modern and contemporary time. Thus, the experience is simultaneously temporalized and historicized. This so-called person of our time, who Tammsaare has in mind, bears the sense of having been broken off the pre-modern tradition, represented in Tammsaare's fiction above all in such features of male protagonists and male-centered narrators as lack of faith, self-reflexivity, splitting, irony or self-irony, pessimism, nervousness, sense of rootlessness, nostalgia, as well as sharpened time consciousness. One of the most important pairs of the sense of being broken off or crisis consciousness in the experience of modernity in the cultural context of 20th century was the Discourse of Decadence, which developed in many centers of Europe in the late 19th century and which by the beginning of the 20th century also reached the peripheries of Europe, including Finnish and Estonian literature. As many researchers have shown, decadence functioned in 20th century Europe as a means of expressing the ambivalence of the experience of modernization that derived from the changes that were taking place due to the acceleration of the process of modernity and the contradictory judgments of these changes. Tammsaare's Shadows is certainly one of the most clear examples of literary decadence, and for this reason probably one of the first examples of the sharpened time consciousness in Tammsaare's work. The events of the novella, as conveyed through the diary of the male protagonist Tomander, take place in a tuberculosis sanatorium. Through Tammsaare's diary, a tragic love story in the Caucasian sanatorium comes of life against the background of southern nature. Tomander has fallen deeply in love with young Sonia Piratova, who is hopelessly ill. While thematically the stimulus of Tomander's sharpened time consciousness is physical decline and the closeness of death, symbolically both the tuberculosis sanatorium and its inhabitants act as a small-scale model of the hypermodern culture that has reached its apex and is therefore declining and lacking vitality. Thus, characteristically to examples of literary decadence, illness functions as a metaphor in the novella, signifier of the different experiences of decline and the dissolution of a sense of unity. Tomander is a typical decadent aesthete, the dissolution of whose sense of unity is conveyed by his inability to grasp the surrounding world as a whole and to see himself as a part of this world. Tomander's opposite, Sonia, is in turn a typical femme fragile, since a femme fragile as a male-centered and implicitly misogynist projection of femininity is not given much flexibility in examples of literary decadence. The reader gets access to emotions that suggest the awareness of decline and sharpened time consciousness, primarily through the perspective of Tomander. Before I give some examples, I would like to mention that Tomander's sharpened time consciousness is in turn strengthened both by the fragmentary form of the novella, following the conventions of diary as a genre, and the resultant style. The following is an elegant discussion from the pages of Tomander's diary. I cite. The attempts to win time seem ridiculous, childishly frivolous are the wisdoms of the brain when a morning fever burns the body. What do we get from the ticking of the clock, from the rising and setting of the sun, if there is still the same glow, the same throbbing pain? Be one idling sleeplessly in the bed or rising from it with bitter, swollen eyes. Perhaps ducks are flying in circles over a round sea, and I hope for the disappearance of the black crow in vain. Time is the bearer of the bearers, time is the creator of the creators, and its unborn tooth will bite the last bones. Beware, pyramid shudders stony chords in rock. Granite mountains, because the steps of time are irrefutable. I, a human being, when I cannot find a grip anywhere, when any consolation becomes daunting, when an unknown force tosses me around as if I were a sliver on flowing water or an oat husk in a windy dressing floor, hurry to seek your help, your merciless, pestering, melancholy time. It would be simple to reduce the spiritual anguish expressed in the extract to merely the awareness of the immanent death of his beloved Sonia. It is also clear that Tomander's existential restlessness is also fed directly by the linear sense of time characteristic of the modern society, which creates both the expectations of disaster associated with the end of time and consciousness of aging, the corrupting influence of time, the most famous example of which is undoubtedly Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Thus, the quote above implicitly expresses protest against the unified, homogeneous consciousness of time. The first-person narrator's consciousness of time is emphatically subjective, intertwined with different understandings of time and lacking in a sense of permanence and certainty. Tomander seems to feverishly seek a possibility to turn his back to the linear mechanistic sense of time, characteristic to modern society, that moves from a starting point to an end. As an alternative, he seeks to make himself believe in a different sense of time, the possibility of cyclical repetition, in the ever again returning sameness, or in the Nietzschean eternal recurrence that alone seems to offer some support. The future orientation of the ordering of the cyclical, ever-repeating time that follows the circle of the seasons is simple. Everything repeats according to the same cycle. Tomander, who has been placed in the position of the modern man, projects this structure of time to the pre-modern time, thereby perceiving that period as offering a simpler, less complex way of life. But this pre-modern simplicity is no longer within Tomander's reach. He is so used to living perpetual motion from the past to the future and to measure the passage of time as a sequence of events that follow each other and depend on each other, that he has lost the ability to do anything but to spend or win time. I have taken another paragraph from the novella Shadows, but I don't have the time to comment this and to read this. Shadows is one of the first of Tammsaare's texts to clearly address different representations of the sharpened time consciousness. We can find other similar examples from his main work, Truth and Justice, and his novel I Love the German. Differently from Shadows, we cannot consider I Love the German an example of literary decadence, since the discourse of decadence does not dominate over other discourses there. However, the novel's male protagonist and first-person narrator, Oscar, in many ways resembles Tomander in his attitudes and stance, and in this text as well, what is foregrounded is the shades of Oscar's soul. This time expressed not in a diary, but a novel he is writing on the basis of his own life. The following quote, inspired by a sharpened time consciousness, stands out amongst the deliberations of Oscar's autobiographical novel. I cite, "Since the toes of shoes are starting to change their shape ever more often, people also have to change their opinions more often, or even cast them aside and only live according to fashion, which perhaps would be the most fashionable principle and worldview. The shoemaker and the tailor shall determine the direction of culture and the level of education." The end of quotation. It is through the keywords fashion and fashionable that this quote falls into a specific temporal context. Fashion, discussed by Baudelaire and later Georg Simmel, is one of the most widespread metaphors of the modern era in the literary texts of the beginning of the 20th century. In this context, however, we should turn our attention to the temporalization of the concept of fashion and the implicit opposition to the rapid changes in fashions, which, with its reference to the shoemaker and tailor as the determinants of the direction of culture, also adds an opposition to the spread of mass culture, In several other places in the novel, contemporary modernity is lowered to the position below the past. For example, Oscar Muse's I cite. He wants some kind of certainty, but it does not exist anymore today. My father has something certain in his own tradition. For me, it is still important that one season should follow the other. Each morning and even his heart sees the confirmation that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Each warm rain shower after a spring showing says to him that there is something certain and lasting in the world. Also the return of birds in the spring and the departure in the fall is a new confirmation to him that everything is the same, that will be sufficient for many generations, so many that it is quite easy to start believing in the eternity. In conclusion, I would like to say that the novel, I Love the German, published 18 years after Shadows, includes clearly recognizable utterances belonging to the discourse of decadence, and it is possible that it is due to them that the examples of sharpened consciousness of time are amplified in the text. Oscar, similarly to Tomander, the protagonist of Shadows, perceives himself to be extremely insecure in his time, and in the case of Oscar, this uncertainty is partially amplified by the modern future-oriented and mechanistic sense of time. This leads to Oscar's increased longing for the predictable pre-modern social arrangements that instill confidence in him. The object of this longing is the imagined state of security familiar to Oscar's father, who hails from the agrarian society, but which Oscar has been robbed of in multiple ways. The pre-modern identity of his ancestors that was based on a cyclical understanding of time gave them the knowledge of the recurrence of everything, filled them with faith in the eternity. But Oscar, who is experiencing all of the negative aspects of the economic crisis, has lost this faith definitively. Thus, as the quoted example demonstrates, Oscar envies his less evolved ancestors. Also, he knows that the modern civilized urbanities and agrarian ancestors lack a common language. However, there is an important difference between Tomander and Oscar. Tomander primarily feels dread about the recurrence projected into the agrarian society. Both the constant threat of the end and the non-existence of the end are equally intolerable. But in the end, he finds his raison d'être in limits. For Oscar, on the other hand, it is the eternity and belief in eternity that seems to promise a chance of achieving certainty and channel the tensions deriving from the all-encompassing sense of ruthlessness. Thus, while the male protagonist of Tomander of Shadows succeeds partly because of his identification with the linear time of the modern society in transcending his decadent past and is at least partly healed, Oscar, the male protagonist of the novel I Love the German, is not freed from the woe of the past on the pages of his novel, and thus remains a decadent to the end. Thank you.